This presentation is provided by BoardPack LLC for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The opinions expressed by the presenters are their own and not necessarily those of BoardPack. On behalf of BoardPack, we welcome you to today's webinar. BoardPack has teamed up with Amazon's #1 best-selling author in board governance, Thomas Bakewell, and fundraising guru Carol Weisman to help educate boards on the latest industry trends. The Boardroom webinar series will focus on different topics each month through the end of 2015. I wanted to mention really quickly that BoardPack is a secure, affordable, and easy-to-use paperless board meeting solution. Users can access materials from the native iPad app or through a web browser on other devices. Private annotations, minutes builder, and unlimited document storage are a few highlights of what we have to offer. Before we jump into today's topic, let me tell you a little bit about today's speakers. Thomas Bakewell works to bring out the best your team has to offer. He is the author of the book, Claiming Your Place at the Boardroom Table. Over the past 30 years, Thomas Bakewell has advised and directed CEOs and presidents of large for-profit and nonprofit corporations. His vast board experience has made him a leader and go-to source in board governance. Carol Weisman, president of Board Builders, is an internationally known speaker, author, trainer, and consultant. Carol specializes in volunteerism, fundraising, and governance. Carol won a Telly Award for her PBS special, Building a Board with a Passion for Mission. Her board experience is vast, having served on 38 boards and served as president of 7. Carol and Tom, take it away.
Well, good morning, Tom. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics.
What is that, Carol? And good morning to you, my friend.
It's either governance or my grandchildren, but I think we're going to do governance today.
Governance? What type of governance? What particular topic?
I think we need to start by defining what is governance, because at one point, I remember probably 40 years ago, I thought it was a misspelling of government. So
well, lots of people do, but governance is a pretty simple topic. It's not a misspelling of government. Interestingly, people have hundreds of definitions of governance if you go looking for it in various places. My favorite definition is governance is a conversation, which is what we're going to have today, a good conversation. My personal definition that I've come up with on my own, governance is experiential and reality-based. So what I mean by that is governance is the matter at hand. If you're on a board or if you're a trustee of a trust or an estate or something, and you're in charge of making something happen, you have to deal with what's right in front of you. Sometimes it's very organized and formal, and sometimes it's like herding cats.
So how is it different from management?
Well, management usually is considered the day-to-day operation of a business.
Now here's our old friend, Peter Drucker, and he is the Dean of Modern Business, would you say?
He's the Dean of Modern Consulting for sure, and the Dean of Modern Management. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And this is his perhaps pessimistic view of governance.
Well, he did say back in the 70s and 80s, several of his publications basically say there's one thing in common that all boards don't have, and that commonality is they do not function. That was based primarily on a concept that was around back then and really lasted until the last decade. A lot of boards had what they called imperial CEOs,
yes,
or imperial board chairs.
Yeah.
That is to say, one person really called the shots.
Right, and we're moving much past that. So what are the current changes in governance? And I think from what I'm seeing, we've got cause for optimism.
We do. There's a large picture here that talks about a spotlight on best practices, and what we're really going to cover today is a broad range of 3 topics that are kind of inextricably linked. We're going to talk about how do you have effective governance. Related to having effective governance is the concept of best practices, and then we're going to talk about models of governance too. But the top line here is, as you see in these bullet points, boards are working much better today. Best practices are becoming important, and models of governance remain important.
So let's talk about the models of governance and how they apply to nonprofits and for-profits.
Well, that's a concept that can get people confused. I had a client not too long ago, CEO of a major company, very bright person, obviously had strong academic credentials and background, and they really were all over they were really hung up on this concept. Well, tell me what the best model of governance is. Give me the best model of governance. Tell me you've never experienced this, Carol.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's what I ask them is, if I'm dealing with a woman, I'll say, what should a dress cost?
Yeah.
And
I want to see how you tie this to governance. Come on, I'm waiting.
They always say it depends.
Yeah, it depends. Okay.
Yes. Is it a wedding dress? Is it a sundress? And this is really pretty much the same.
Yeah, same thing with governance. So on models of governance, let's just talk about a couple overviews here. We have traditional corporate governance, that's traditional boards. That's what most people think of from the corporate world. I like to say a lot of your nonprofit governance is based on trust law. Now, it's gone to a lot of different places, and we'll get back to that later in our talk today. But nonprofit governance is the concept of a guardianship or protecting the assets of a company. There's a concept which came up out of the Harvard School, the Kennedy School of Governance, called generative governance, which was really focused on being much more strategic versus the fiduciary responsibility. Collaborative model. Do you have any comments on the collaborative model?
No, I think it's we've seen that both in nonprofits and for-profits.
Yeah, it speaks for itself. It's just what model we're going to use. There's a model that some people think is very famous. Some say infamous. It's one that always stirs commentary. It's the Carver model.
And I think the challenge with John Carver is that he is a Canadian. And one of the challenges is he believed that it wasn't the job of a nonprofit board to raise funds. And the staff felt differently. So,
well, that's an interesting twist. Let's put it in a good mode here, though. The Carver model was a very widely known model. Dr. Carver was a professor, has written widely. I'll say this right up front. Anything he writes is exceptionally good. He's a terrific writer.
He's a good speaker, too.
He's a good speaker. And if you want to study the concepts of governance or the theory of governance, you can't go wrong picking up any Carver model. The flip side is, Carol and I are spending a few moments here. We've both had experience with the Carver model. We won't say anything other than to say, if you go out into the literature, and particularly interesting from the legal field, there's a lot of commentary and criticism of the Carver model. So with that, please know that it's a well-respected, well-regarded, and model that's used a lot. I've got another one here. If you're looking for the theory of good governance, the best single document I've ever seen is from the National Association of Corporate Directors, and it's called The Key Agreed Principles, and we'll spend a few minutes on that later in the program. So here's a question for you. What's the most difficult board to manage, Carol? How would you answer that?
I think actually the most difficult board to manage is a diverse board, and those are the best boards.
Okay, now diverse is a word that covers a wide range of topics, so we'll get to that later.
We're going to get to that, but here's the thing.
Yeah, tell me about it.
When everybody thinks the same, you can make quick decisions.
Yeah, and here's what I like to say. When everybody thinks the same, nobody thinks much.
Exactly, and you get bad decisions.
Yeah, and I also say on difficult, there actually is a punchline from my end on what's the most difficult board to manage. Now, the cheeky response is, well, it's the board I'm dealing with today or the board I'm on. But the precise answer in my mind is there's a type of board. It would be another model of governance, a joint venture board.
Sure.
Many companies, even not-for-profits, for-profits, still go into a business arrangement with somebody and they'll have a joint venture. And oftentimes the problem with a joint venture board is nobody's in charge. Well, we own 50%, you own 50%, and you have two different groups trying to manage one organization, and it's always very difficult.
It's a little like the EU right now with one currency and many governments. So let's talk about the best organizations and about leadership.
You know, if there was an overarching word I would use for all this topic of models of governance and best practices and good governance, it would be it's about leadership. There's 100 ways you can do it, but what team do you pull together to make it really happen and make it work? And that not only talks about a board, but it talks about management, talks about outside shareholders, all kinds of things. A lot of the words you have here on the screen: management, board, stakeholders. Stakeholders is a term that is broader than stockholders, so if you're dealing with a not-for-profit, you can have stakeholders. Even a for-profit company can have lots of parties other than the stockholders who have a say.
And you're looking right now, the VW
You're thinking of the automobile crisis where they're looking at
Absolutely.
$10 or $12 billion because a couple aggressive managers decided we might cheat a little bit?
Yeah.
Never
Exactly.
happens. Never happens.
No.
Okay.
And it doesn't in soccer either. FIFA has never had a problem.
No.
So this happens in nonprofits and for-profits, and that's when the stakeholders, and it can be the government, gets involved.
Yeah, large, small, and everything in between.
So let's talk about what are your thoughts on best practices?
Yeah, let's try and get towards some definitions of best practices. And as I key this up, I want to give you an example, and you've had these too. Again, you're very active in the field of governance, and I was at a governance conference not too long ago, and here came a fellow from Malaysia. Good for him for coming all the way to the U.S. to find out about governance and to learn and to train. And I was speaking, and he was the first one up afterwards, and he said, "You have to tell me before I go back what are the best 100 practices of governance." And actually, we'll touch on those today. But somebody who
not all 100. Don't worry,
no,
listeners.
we're good. We're down. We're okay. But somebody who's looking for answers,
Sure.
And there are no easy answers when it comes to governance. It's kind of like you talk about weight loss and what else. Never mind.
Oh, cellulite.
Yeah.
A number of things.
Easy
Important
things to
issues
fix.
of our time.
Easy things to fix. Okay, but here we have leading principles and practices. This is my best simple definition of best practice. It's the leading principles and practice that help boards, directors, and management govern more effectively. So what are the things you can do on a board or in an organization to help it govern more effectively?
And then our best practices mandatory requirement, and who sets the rules here?
Yeah, that's a real question. So that's right out of the box. Our best practices, a legal requirement or mandatory. And as a rule, surprisingly, they're not. If you go looking to check the rules and the laws, you'll find that most best practices aren't required. Now, that's changing, and any good lawyer or any good executive listening who could immediately say, wait a minute, I know this best practice is required or whatever. So an example or two of where they are required is a company required to have a financial audit. Well, the practical reality is many of them are. Even the smallest not-for-profits, if they file a 990, if they file, which most of them are required to do, if they want any kind of bank loan, if they want any kind of proper fiduciary duty, they're required to have an audit. That would be a best practice. If you're a public company, stringent rules about what you have to have in terms of best practices, and we're going to get into some of those. So the question becomes, are best practices required of not-for-profits? Yes, they are required of them as well.
So what happens if you don't meet?
Well, sometimes it can be pretty onerous. And let me give you one simple example of this. It used to be with the IRS, and I'm not talking about all the dust-ups that have been in the press and all with filing or not filing or whether you can get your taxes up status or not. But it used to be if a not-for-profit, nice little not-for-profit, forgot to file their annual report or their 990 or something like that, all they would have to do is pick up the phone, get some nice person at the IRS, say, hey, we forgot to file it, and they'd say, okay, well, send us on in and maybe send us a $25 penalty or something, and you're back in business. Worked with a not-for-profit not too long ago. It was a wonderful, charitable healthcare organization that takes care of the elderly, and primarily from a ministry and a charity perspective, so money's always an issue. And they operate 3 different organizations. If you look at them from an outside, from a lawyer point of view, it looks like one organization. But they actually have 3 organizations, so they file 3 990s. Well, they had their outside accountants had a young, new accountant come in to do the filing, and they didn't pick up that it was 3 organizations, so they only filed 1 990. And here comes the penalty, $10,000 per.
Whoa.
For not filing. Yeah, whoa. And now the good news is I could tell that the executive director, you just call the accountant in a nice way, ask him who their insurance carrier is.
Really.
Yeah, and it got taken care of.
Yeah.
But it cost somebody a lot of money to fix that problem. So sometimes the laws can really be pretty important. Moving on.
What's the primary difference between for-profit and nonprofits?
Now, this is one that you and I could debate, and I'm going back to a fundamental difference here. So a common misperception, just overarching, a lot of people think, well, the concept of not-for-profit means you're not making a profit. Of course, that's not true. We have a lot of not-for-profits that make a lot of profits. The legal definition there is no profit may inure to the benefit of any particular individual. But beyond that, I always like to say there's two basic primary differences, two extremes. The not-for-profit world traditionally was focused on a fiduciary duty of preserving assets, and a lot of the not-for-profit laws came out of trust law. Now, I could get into a debate with you right here, and you could tell me, let's do it right now, what are some of the opposite trends of that going on in the not-for-profit world today? What's happening with the really big foundations that have a lot of money? Are they hanging out there forever today?
Absolutely not. And we're seeing more and more foundations, and I think this is being led by the thoughts of Mr. Buffett and Mr. Gates about dynastic wealth, is they don't necessarily want to have something go on forever. I think a lot of this happened during the AIDS epidemic because money was coming in. Mm-hmm. It was an acute cause. People were dying and money went out. Mm-hmm. Then it became a chronic disease. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden they had no money.
So what are one or two of the other charities? So let me be clear on this. Some of the major foundations that have been around with the hundreds of millions of dollars that give out, 5 or 10% a year,
sure,
or maybe even, less than that, are actually taking a different approach. They're saying in 5 or 10 or 20 years, we're going to give away all our money.
Yes.
Oh.
And I think the other thing, and this is quite different, is that there are, and this is the good news, this is really exciting, there are organizations that are going out of business that want to go out of business.
Right.
Now, it's organizations like Hansen's disease, which is another word for leprosy. Mm-hmm. And also, there's no Sudden Infant Death Syndrome Foundation anymore because with the Back to Sleep program, so few deaths are occurring, which is very exciting news. And I hope that we all live in the near future to see all the breast cancer organizations go out of business. Very different from the opera.
Yes, of course.
You want opera. I don't want opera. I'm not an opera buff.
My daughter wants opera. She loves opera.
Your daughter has a gorgeous voice. Yes. But I mean, for me, it's dance. But regardless, there are some causes that we really want forever.
Right.
And that's frequently the arts, and there'll always be a need for social services. So they're not moving towards ending.
Good. So getting back to the differences here, so I went down a little bit of a path there. We did, but really, so I've always believed that on a fundamental basis, not-for-profits have the primary duty of what's the traditional fiduciary duty, looking out for and being a little more cautious. Again, there's tons of very entrepreneurial not-for-profits, and that's another trend that's going on today. But the for-profit primary function has always been to take risk and make money. That's the primary difference in my book. Just a little theory there, the primary difference to keep in mind with not-for-profit versus for-profit.
So, it's easy, except...
Governance is easy, except, and you could make 100 bullet points, but here's a couple common ones that most of our listeners have had. Boards getting in the way of management. Maybe one or maybe
all five.
Maybe all five. The board's failing at oversight. Operations don't work. Owners, directors, and management disagree, and on and on and on.
And I think this is why one of your things that you're so good at is the issue of strategy.
Yep.
And what one needs to really make it work is buy-in.
Not only buy-in, but it's having a team to come together.
Yes.
A lot of times the real fundamental issue is how can we get people to work together. You could have a room full of brilliant people, and if they aren't working together well, it's just not going anywhere as a rule.
No, and it can be one person to unite or one person to make the whole place explode.
So let's talk about some of the trends on effective governance. And again, the good news for Drucker and others, we are seeing a lot of change today after decades of hard work in governance.
Well, let's talk about these positive trends.
Absolutely. So public companies, now we're talking again, it could be public companies, private companies, not-for-profit, joint ventures, lots of different organizational structures. But a lot of the public company governance rules are really driving change throughout the world of governance. And part of the reason is that public companies have been under such scrutiny in the past decade. Everybody will remember this little thing called Sarbanes-Oxley, and then there was another major federal round of laws that came along with Dodd-Frank, and they have prompted major change in the public. So we're going to look at 4 profound changes from my perspective that are really impacting all organizations. Carol, give us a comment on the second half here, though, about the not-for-profits.
Well, it's an election cycle right now, and actually most of the fundraising trends that you see in the nonprofit world come from political fundraising, and it's fascinating to watch. A lot of the direct mail that we do in the nonprofit world came out of the Reagan years when they I'm forgetting his name right
the
now.
RNC or something like
Right,
the Republican National
Committee built the Reagan War chest on direct
Mm-hmm.
mail, and then things have moved on. Then the Democrats had a crack at making a lot of money with Joe Trippi, and he raised $40 million online for Howard Dean.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Obama ran, they raised
Social media
million,
went
120
over
million
the top.
in a month.
In a month.
Yeah.
Amazing. Good.
So
Interesting trends. So we're saying the for-profit trends have been driven very much by public company laws, and you're saying some of the practical realities of what's going on in the not-for-profit world have been pulled from political and world of fundraising. Very cool.
Absolutely. So we're talking profound changes.
Yeah, so here's one, and again, this is primarily for-profit, but the majority of directors must be independent. So let me give you a real-life case on that one, very simple. We remember our friend Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was the kind of man who, when he was invited to be on a board, not only was he given a director's fee, but he was hired as an advisor and a consultant, so he'd get a couple $100,000 a year extra for that, and then on top of which his global firm of people who followed all the political activity would be hired as well. And you have to ask: are there too many, irons in the fire? Are there too many conflicts there? Is there a lack of independence by having that? And so the public laws have said if you are a director of a public company, you can't have any of this going on. You can't have close family members working in the company for the board that you're on. So it's moved towards keeping it tight. And you were using a political example, and I'll use another one, not to pick on anybody and go too far with this. But on a current basis, it's the same issues that will be raised with the top Democratic candidate at the current time,
sure.
Hillary, about the family foundation and how money, was it too close with her being a high, public servant and the organization out raising money, and, was there really a lack of independence there? You can bet that'll show up. Making no comment about where it would or not. And this has gotten actually deeper, even deeper with a lot of the litigation and all. What's happened is, if you are on a corporate board and that board gives $1 million to your alma mater, the school you went to, is that a conflict, and is that inappropriate? Do you have to get off that board? And it's even gotten to the silly zone where it's not only that, but who you play golf with, or who your kids go to school with, or whose wedding you went to. I mean, they try and make those kinds of claims to say you're not independent. But there's some good key rules there, and that's what's happened with independence.
So also the audit committee, and in the nonprofit world, the finance committee seems to be frequently the most solid committee.
Right. It's also often called the finance committee audit, whatever committee the auditors work for. There's another profound change, and here's the bottom line. You talk to anybody who is in the know in this industry and in this world, the outside auditors, the financial auditors, the accountants, frankly, they used to work for management.
Sure.
Even though you'd go kind of through this little formality, they come in and give their report once a year if you're a not-for-profit director and you're sitting around the table. They used to work for management. That has changed, particularly with public company boards, that they work for the board and the board committee. So major, profound change, and that's really...
and the stakeholders.
Very much so.
Especially if the board members are... not playing fair.
Yeah, absolutely. So very important. Subtle change, but very important. This next profound change has really gotten into it, and I want to see if you've had any experience with this. But basically, what didn't used to happen is the board would meet, and the management team would always be in the room, or at least the CEO. And one of the profound changes now is that they have what's called an executive session without the CEO present, so the board members can truly talk among themselves. Have you seen this or dealt with this at all?
Yes,
yeah.
And I've had mixed reactions from the CEOs. Sure. Sometimes they think it's a great idea, and those are the people who generally think they're doing a good job.
Yes.
And they're not afraid of criticism, and there's a profound lack of paranoia.
Yeah.
Other ones feel that, why can't you say it to my face? I would say something to your face, blah, blah, blah. And so it can get quite tricky. But it is considered a best practice by many larger nonprofits usually.
Yeah, absolutely a best practice. And the fourth one, and this is another one that's been in the press a lot lately, the issue of who's in charge of the board. Do you have an independent lead or a presiding chair, different names and titles, or do you have a joint chair and CEO? In the public world, it used to be public company world, you would almost universally have one person who had both the chair title and the CEO title. Well, just in the press in the last week, we've had a big dust-up with Bank of America. They have a banker. The Bank of America went through the financial crisis that all the other banks in the United States did in the last decade. They fought back. They're doing well. They have a joint chair and CEO, and a number of the outside shareholders, particularly the large pension funds, what they call the active shareholders, were seeking to remove the title of chair from this CEO. It was a very close vote. This happened about a year ago with the CEO of JP Morgan. And the question becomes, should the one person have both titles? And the arguments are pro and con, but what you are seeing is a lot more independence. The trend that I'm seeing on a practical basis, when a new CEO comes in, the old CEOs had joint titles. The new CEO comes in and does not get the joint title, but somebody else on the board takes the chair role. And there's always the tension there. How do you get people to work together there? A chair, if you get a powerful chair who is really looking to be a CEO,
yes.
It takes a unique person to kind of to hold that role. So
we see this with founders in
Yep.
the nonprofit world, because they wind up. I just talked to a founder recently whose organization's not that young. It's 10 years old. And I said, what do you do? And she said, I'm the president, I'm the CEO. I said, what else do you do? I'm the chief fundraiser. I take out the trash.
Right.
It's an organization that produces books. I do the editing. I said, are you doing the writing? She said, no, we have children. It's focused on children. But I said, is there anything you don't do? And she said, well, I'd love to have the board do the fundraising. And I thought, good luck.
Good luck. Yeah.
Good luck. But
because they're not engaged.
No.
She's doing everything. They're
No.
coming along for just to have their name associated or because they were asked, whatever.
Well, and I think sometimes a person's victimized by their own talent.
Sure, absolutely.
And passion.
Sure, absolutely. The other comment I would use on that, another example with the not-for-profit world, it goes back to what you just touched on, the donors. How much say does a major donor have, or does a major funding source have? So this is all about politics and influence.
Absolutely.
And how do you have good influence, and what's the best practice?
And again, being clear, what is your job and what's somebody else's job?
Clarity of roles is very important, and you could argue that this is best practice, or does this make good sense or whatever. But again, so the couple of the issues that you're seeing that really help a board get clear from a best practice point of view is the issue of the independent lead or presiding director, and the presiding director refers to somebody if the chair's not there, or it's an administrative role. If somebody's not in the room, who's going to head the meeting? They may not have any other power. Independent lead director might make up the agendas and run the meeting. It's just who's going to. You can put different definitions on these terms, but it's about having an effective board, chair leadership. And you won't get that unless you have a CEO committed to top governance. This is your example of a confident CEO saying, yes, let's have executive sessions because that makes perfect sense, and it's good for me too. And you all have honest conversation, and if something's not going right, you let me know it. You can cut off problems. Another great tool, and you can find these easily available online. Again, some of the best examples are with the public company documents. Board charters for committees, and I'm sure you're seeing this in the not-for-profit world a lot. Having a really good charter that clearly says this is the rules or the role of the board for this committee. Very important. Level of engagement of the board, we're going to talk about in a little bit, but there's, how engaged should our board be? You just gave an example of a founder director who really doesn't have a board that's engaged much at all.
No, she's doing everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at that right now. How engaged ought the board be? Now, this is from a source by a fellow named David Nadler. You can actually find this lady named Beverly Behan. I think they maybe worked together earlier in their careers. But it's a concept, how engaged should we be? And it's a good way to look at boards. You go from one extreme, what's called a passive board, all the way to the other extreme called an operating board. And let's just take a moment and look at how this is. And I'm going to ask Carol here as we go through this passive, certifying, engaged, intervening, operating, to give an experience or two. I'm sure you've been involved from one end of passive to the other end of
Absolutely.
operating. Yeah.
The most passive board I ever worked with was a fairly amazing board that met once a year
Yeah.
for an hour and a half.
Right.
And the CEO, who was also the founder, who was also led trips out of the country to benefit this organization, her biggest challenge in getting ready for her yearly board meeting was baking.
Mm-hmm.
And so she would bake a bunch of stuff, tell people what she'd been doing, and then she actually didn't drink coffee. For religious reasons, they would have tea and eat a lot of baked goods and say, well done, see you next year.
Well, I'm curious. Was it an effective board? Was it successful? Was it a powerful board? What?
It was a passive board, but she was doing great work, and she was funding everything herself.
Oh, well, that makes it a lot easier.
And so,
kind of like Donald Trump running for president, right? I'll just write the check and make it easy.
Yeah, so it was very easy, and she was doing great work, and she didn't even ask them any questions.
Yeah.
I think they just liked baked goods.
Yeah, so this is what you see with a passive board. They just basically show up and they ratify what management did, and they might have an opinion or whatever. Certifying board, some boards are required to certify things like quarterly, or we have an annual meeting, or we have an annual financial audit, and they just rubber stamp it. An engaged board, arguably, you could almost think of a bell-shaped curve drawn over this. Ideally, people would argue an engaged board's the best one. They give insight, the advice, they support the CEO and management teams. The two on the right, the intervening board and operating board, a lot of times that's when the wheels are coming off. My story is I started on a board, wonderful little college, and we had an Imperial chairman.
Yes.
A wonderful guy. He could talk to all the money people in town. He could get the check, but he didn't know a thing about running a college. And you would come when he told you to come, and you would speak when he told you to speak, and don't you dare speak if you weren't told to speak. I mean, it was that's the way it was. Well, the college ran into the ditch. The wheels came off. Things went bad. We had a financial crisis. We got what's called a going concern audit opinion. That's not a good thing. It says they doubt if you can continue as a business. And a number of the board members had to take the bull by the horns, and we literally become operating. So, for example, we had a fundraising department that had 6 executives, and they were raising $1 million a year, and it was costing us $1 million a year. They were spending. And the handful of board members that were left said, the loyal ones that stuck around said, we're going to raise that $1 million a year, and other than the secretary in that department, we're not going to have any staff.
Yep.
And that's how we dug ourselves out of the hole. But that's an example of an operating board. We were literally making decisions. It's not a good thing to do it, but sometimes when companies have crisis or when companies start up and they're brand new. Exactly. Any other comments on this?
And that's exactly what happened with this passive board became an operating board when the founder, who was also the funder, passed away. Mm-hmm. And she cared deeply about this organization. She left some money.
Right.
But there was nobody to fulfill it. Mm-hmm. And there was no money for staff. And so, in fact, the board, many people left because they said, one of the women who I just adored, I thought she was very funny, she said, we shouldn't pay staff. It's always been volunteer. And I said, terrific. What do you plan to do and how many hours a month can you give? Well, I have a job. Well, then we need staff. But it's always been volunteer. Well, one woman did it 80 hours a week.
Right.
And so
one last question before we move on here. Who did the baking?
But that was, everybody got thinner and we hiked more.
All right, there you go. Okay, so here's some of the other areas where we've had key changes. It's a long list, but we're going to blow through these. Most of these come from, I've mentioned the National Association of Corporate Directors. They do an annual survey of both public and not-for-profit and private company boards. So 3 different surveys, a great source. You know some great sources for surveys on the not-for-profit world. What are some of the ones you would go to?
My favorite ones, I love Board Source, the Myers Foundation, Independent Sector.
Yeah, all great organizations.
Really great groups.
A lot of data. So what are some of the key changes? Read down that list for us and just give us a sentence on each one.
Size is going down in nonprofit boards.
Size of the number of people on the board.
Right. The largest board I've ever worked with was 330, which was fairly insane. The smallest board, 3.
Yep.
And so the average board, this doesn't mean optimal for a nonprofit, is 16 or 17.
Very good. What's term? What are we talking about there? How long? Term limit? Is that what we're talking about there?
Right. And the average now for nonprofits is to have term limits, and the average is 2 3-year terms with a year off.
Okay. Diversity, that's probably a pretty wide definition today.
Absolutely. I was working once in Iowa, and I loved this. I said, do you have a diverse board? And they were very excited, and they said, yes, we have a Catholic.
Oh, my.
And I thought,
as opposed to a Protestant?
I don't know.
Okay.
It was just, but in that
And they probably had a farmer or two as well, right?
Well, that was 100% of the board.
Yeah.
But they had no Catholics in the community. They served nobody other than people like themselves, which was, that was diversity.
In their definition. Yep.
In their definition was this Catholic guy.
Succession, moving on.
And organization,
speaking of which, moving on.
Right, is to have a succession plan, and that's for nonprofits and for-profits. And
for both the board and the CEO, senior
everybody,
leaders. Yeah, okay.
Everybody gets evaluated. And then we're going to be talking about evaluations soon.
Yep.
And strategic focus, I think really having a clear strategy that you share and that everybody buys into is becoming more and more. One of my clients has values and focus written every place. It has 9 locations, and they mean it.
They mean it. Absolutely. And of course, our topic that we're speaking on today, best practice awareness. A lot of awareness of we do need to use best practice. So again, the size of the board, you mentioned the not-for-profit, so this is just some survey data. Public, the size is becoming smaller. When it says they're mega versus nano, when you look at public company boards, everybody thinks of the Fortune 500, but the vast majority of public companies are actually very small, and they have these definitions of what's a mega board or a nano board, and it's usually like 500 million, 100 million, 50 million in size and revenue or assets. Private company boards, a typical family or private company business now has about 7 or 8 people on it. And not-for-profit, comment on that. What do you see? Is that a trend that's carrying on there?
I'm seeing both, and it depends. The fantasy, I think, is that the more people you have, the more money you'll make.
Right.
And that's not necessarily true. And so what I'm seeing a lot of, and again, it depends on the area of the nonprofit world. I'm seeing some boards, especially arts boards, that may have 100 people on it, but an executive committee of 15. And that's really what you're talking about.
Yeah, another place where you've seen that trend is with the complexity in the healthcare industry.
Yes.
Like when you have some of these hospital systems where there are, billions and billions of dollars
Absolutely.
in revenue. It's nice to have a 40-person board for fundraising, but when it comes time to getting the work done for an executive review, et cetera, it's better with 8 or 9 or 10 people.
And that tends to be the executive committee functioning as the board.
Right, good.
Terms of service, and we've already mentioned this, one of the things that's very different about the for-profit world than the nonprofit is I personally do not know any nonprofit board that had a mandatory age limit.
Yes.
And that's quite different from the for-profit.
Yeah, and what's curious about the for-profit is now they're having, a lot of organizations didn't have age limits, now they're having them. And there's a polarity going on. On the one hand, boards are trying to get much younger. On the other hand, they're saying people who are 70 and 75 are a lot more vital today, so let's keep them around till they're 80 or so. And they're actually extending that. So you got this polarity on. They're trying, you're now seeing even in major public companies, people in their 30s, even occasionally in their late 20s, going on their boards, and where it used to be all white males in their 50s or 60s or 70s. So
Sure.
It's changing. And we talked about diversity. Why don't you just blow through this really quickly?
Well, I think diversity, it means a whole lot of different things to different boards. And I remember years ago, because I'm in my 60s, when I joined one of my first boards, I was the diverse member because I was a woman. There were no women on the board. And years ago, the difference between a volunteer and a board member was gender. And so now it's really very wide. So it's everything from race, gender, experience. I'm on boards with 23-year-olds. I'm on boards with 90-year-olds. I also work with groups where diversity may be experiential. So you are a cancer survivor.
Right.
You live in a particular community. You went to this school, and sometimes not at all. So it can be. My sister was on a board, unfortunately, of family members who had lost children from sudden infant death syndrome. It was 35 years ago, and 100% had that experience.
Yeah.
And my suggestion in terms of diversity for my sister was get some people on the board who haven't had that loss, so that you can bounce ideas off of them, because when you've all had this same horrific experience, you can easily get into groupthink.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be critical, but I give my comment from before. When everybody thinks alike, nobody thinks much. So another trend you're seeing in diversity is it used to be on the public company boards, the for-profit. All the CEOs around town would get together and literally have all their board meetings on one day in one club, and they were all on each other's boards.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's a trend today for major companies to move away from all CEOs, and for a lot of different reasons. The companies today the companies that used to say, yes, CEO, you can sit on 5 boards, they're saying to their CEO today, you sit on 1 board, it's ours, or at most you sit on 2, and you take your junior executives and send them out and let them get some board experience. You take the women on the rise, you take the minority on the rise, you take your top executives on the rise and give them some great experience. So what you're seeing is a lot of boards, even at the public company level, that have other than CEOs on them, which is a great thing. Technology is becoming hot, people with technology skills. It used to be like in the banking industry, all you would have is other bankers around the board. They're moving away from that. And there's been a move to have what's called savvy strategists, but you're seeing something different in the not-for-profit world on that.
Well, basically, what I'm hearing from executive directors is if you ask them, what would you like from your board?
Money. I got all the strategy I need. I got enough brains on my own.
I have a clear strategy.
Yeah.
And some of them think their board members are ATMs, which is a big mistake.
Yeah, big mistake.
And
so it's all about balance. It's about diversity and what?
And listening.
Okay. I got to get better at listening.
Succession on board.
Okay, well, this was another one of those areas where there's been a major topic change, and this goes back to the Drucker and the Imperial CEO. It used to be taboo to talk about a CEO leaving or moving out, or a chairman of the board, or a key director, and today it's business as usual. We review all the board members, we review all the key executives, and, I've literally been in board meetings today. This will show how far it's come. I've been in board meetings today, and when I say today, in the current times, where a new CEO is hired and they walk in the room, and in the first board meeting, they're talking about succession planning for my replacement, even though they may be a CEO for 10 or 12 or 15 years.
Yes.
So.
And the same thing's true in the nonprofit world. And I think as those of us get older, we realize there's a Mack truck potential.
Absolutely. Now, one of our topics coming up soon is going to be board evaluations. And again, back to the rule changes with public companies. Why have public company board evaluations gone from 30% having evaluations a decade ago to 90% now? The answer, it's required to have a board evaluation. So we're seeing a slow build on annual reviews. When you're talking about an evaluation, what do you mean? Is it the whole board? Is it a committee? Is it individuals? You're seeing lots of whole board reviews, but now you're starting to see individual director reviews, et cetera. It's about improving your performance and getting feedback.
And again, the strategic focus of the board.
Yeah, and it's an overview. Again, board used to be very fiduciary oriented. Now you're getting them looking very much forward-looking. What's our strategy? What's the talent? What's the money we have to spend? And then the last category is this issue of renewal. And you can come up with lots of catchy words: reconstituting a board, reinventing a board, transforming a board, replacing a board.
Medicating a board.
My example, again, with the little college I worked on, the one simple change that was profound was when we decided on that college board, for reasons I won't bore you with, we were going to go from primarily big city corporate execs who really weren't engaged in that small little college to local entrepreneurs who thought, a lot of them who didn't have college degrees, who thought it was the biggest thing in the world to be on that college board. And we became very entrepreneurial because of that. So just a comment, overview here on best practices, and that comment is 2 comments. Best practices are subjective. Again, some people say, give me the list of 100, but they're subjective. Do they work for us? And there's something you can aspire to. The fellow that said, I want the 100, I said, look, pick 2 or 3 and work on those and aspire to those. And when you get that right, come back and we'll get 2 or 3 more.
Exactly.
And if somebody was listening, if my friend who actually did say, the fellow from Malaysia said, what are the best practices, where's the list, I would steer him to 3 or 4 very good sources, and I'm going to do the same with everybody here. Anybody listening can go online right now, Google up, go to the General Motors website. You don't even have to do that. Just put in General Motors Corporate Governance Guidelines, and you will get a list of best practices that have been worked on for over 30 years at General Motors. And it includes things like, let's go to the next slide here. Here's the major categories: the introduction, of course, selection and composition of the board, board functioning, board relationships, meeting procedures, etc. Let me just tick off 1 or 2 of these and have you do the same. So when talking about selection of the board, what would be 1 or 2 of the things that come to mind for you?
Well, and again, we're getting into diversity and difference in background, skills, knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. So board functioning, that's the issue. Who's going to be the lead director? Are we going to have a lead director? Are we going to have a chair? What's the size of the board going to be? Important questions that when you start thinking, you'll say, oh, are we going to have former CEOs on the board or not? So a whole long list of those. Board relationship to senior management. That's going to be, does the senior management come to the board meeting or not? Do we have executive committees or not? Another big question in a lot of companies, and especially in not-for-profits, it gets back to strong leaders or not. Does the board have access to senior management without with the permission? Yeah, without the CEO's permission,
without going through the turnstile.
Exactly, without going through the And then meeting procedures, that's the day-to-day agendas and all. Who prepares the agenda? There's a question for you. And on and on and on. And let's look at another great source here. Here's another great not-for-profit source. It's called the Principles Workbook. You can get it free online at Independent Sector. It's called the Principles Workbook. There's actually a companion book that goes with it, so you might have to dig to find the right one. They put in the not-for-profit orientation 4 categories for best practice: compliance and disclosure, effective governance, strong financial oversight, and responsible fundraising. So an example of compliance and disclosure would be whistleblower policy. Do we have one or not? Do we have a conflicts of interest policy or not? An example of effective governance would be, do we have diversity? How often do we meet? What are the responsibilities of the board? An example of strong financial oversight would be things like, what do we do with our financial records? How do we handle our budgets? How do we handle our audits? How do we handle our investments? A big issue in not-for-profits a lot of time once they've raised the money.
Sure.
And then the last one is, of course, responsible fundraising, which is your sweet spot. And what are 1 or 2 of the areas that you would get into if you were looking at best practices on responsible fundraising?
Well, I think you have to look at the Association of Fundraising Professionals Donor Bill of Rights.
Donor Bill of Rights. I didn't know there was such a thing.
Yes.
Yep.
And that really spells it out, I think, in the best possible way. And it covers all the principles that are mentioned here.
Good. And now I'm going to be shameless here. There's another source. If you don't want to go digging for these sources, you can buy my book. And
I just want to say that Tom has 2 children who will be in college next year. So buy his book.
Thanks for the plug.
It's good, and the kids need to be educated.
And it's about, even though the initial title is Claiming Your Place at the Boardroom Table, the smaller title is it's an essential handbook for excellence in governance, and that's what it's about. Another great source I mentioned, the NACD has the key agreed principles. If you ever want to sit down over a good glass of wine or a cup of coffee and think about the really great theory of good governance, find the NACD's key agreed principles. You can just scan down there. It's the same categories: board responsibility, transparency, director competency and commitment, objectivity, independent board leadership, integrity, a long list of great things.
And finally, what's becoming a new practice, and this is something that's always evolving, and that's one of the challenges for your Malaysian gentleman, is do his board members all have computers?
Yes. And
a
best practice is, do you have a board portal, and one of the top companies in the industry, in the business on it, particularly for people that like the best bang for their buck, is BoardPack.
Quality at a price.
So in closing, you've heard me say it many times, and what I say is... Governance is governance, and governance is as serious as a heart attack. If you don't get it just right, either one of those topics can kill you. So here's the question as we close. What will you consider doing differently? What best practice will you look at so that you have effective governance?
Thanks so much.
Thank you again to Tom and Carol for your wonderful insight today. If you have any questions or comments for today's speakers, their contact information is on the screen. If you have interest in learning more about BoardPack, please send us an email, sales@boardpack.com.